Welcome to Let's Talk Space Medicine. I'm Kyle Anderson, your medical student slash space nerd host. For your listening entertainment, I gather my other medically inclined space nerd friends to talk all things space medicine. With our powers combined, we hope to explore and entertain the medical questions that stand between us and the stars. Today's orbit, MSK Health, muscle versus bone. As a brief disclaimer, anything discussed on Let's Talk Space Medicine should not be considered medical advice, and is therefore not a substitute for seeking medical help from a doctor. We are simply interested in entertaining topics in the field of space medicine. And today I am joined by a whole host of space nerd friends, space nerd friends, Ryan and Vlad, both medical students at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine, and our new space nerd friend, Vienna. So thank you for joining us today. Vienna was one of the first people to be interested in our channel, and so happy to have you today. And you are joining us from Adelaide, Australia, so thanks for waking up early and joining us today. So,
Great to be here.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started on our muscle versus bone debate and why I may have invited you in particular for this topic?
As I said, my name is Vienna. I'm a final year medical student at the University of Adelaide. And Kyle and I connected through how most people in space medicine connect, spontaneously and serendipitously. And it's just great. So it's nice to meet people from overseas who are interested in the same thing. We are a rare breed indeed, aren't we, Kyle? I have always been interested in space since I was younger. I chose medicine as a profession because of the job security and because of the interpersonal skills that it would give me. And when I discovered that space medicine was a field that existed in the world, I knew that that's something that I wanted to pursue. So since then, I was able to do a bit of networking and become a member of the space community here in Australia, and then get to know people around the world like you, like the three of you. And last year, I was fortunate to do an honours project in the field of space medicine, and the official title for the degree was Bachelor of Health and Medical Sciences Honours. However, I was fortunate to connect with a team from overseas, based pretty much in the UK and Europe, and the project from which I got the data was called AgBreezer, which stands for Artificial Gravity at the European Space Agency. This was a multi-million-dollar project that was sponsored by NASA, ESA, and DLR, the German Space Agency, and it was run in Cologne, in a place called NVHAB in Germany. Where it's a dedicated facility for space medicine research. And the project was a 60-day bed rest study. So the project recruited 24 healthy participants to lie in bed for 60 days. And what happened was many different research groups studied these people. It was a very good opportunity to study an analog of space in terms of microgravity. And these people would lie at 6 degrees head down tilt to simulate the effect of microgravity on the human body, such as the fluid shifts and the lack of muscle loading. And our project, our team, which comprised of people from the UK and the US and Germany and Australia, we looked at what would happen to the muscles before and after the 60 days of bed rest. And specifically, I looked at the MRI scans of gluteal muscles, or the butt muscles. So I like talking about butts. that's my field of expertise. Our gluteal muscles are very important for standing, and we stand and walk and mobilize and even sit on them. So they're very active, and they're capable of exerting big forces. And so we wanted to see what would happen after a simulated 60-day flight. Obviously, what we found was that the gluteal muscles decreased in volume, and increased in their fatty content after 60 days. So I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about that, but it was a successful research project, and I've caught the research bug now, so I'm hoping to do more research as my career continues, and hopefully call myself a space doctor one day.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. I thought you sent me a link to one of your talks, and I thought, wow, like there was this whole study I had not heard of, and was really interested to see kind of your findings, because at the time that we first communicated, you were like writing your thesis, your final thesis. So yeah, finding that the volume was decreased and increased fatty content, that seems like pretty analogous to aging, right? Like is muscle tone definitely decreases over time, and you have more kind of fatty infiltrates. So I thought that was an interesting kind of finding that you had, and I'm kind of curious. A lot of the time they have like a treatment group, like a time where you're able to use loading or something like that to try and to mitigate this problem. Was that a part of the study as well?
Yeah, of course. That's why it's called artificial gravity at AgBreezer, because not only did everyone have to go through 60 days of bed rest, but 16 of the 24 participants every day they were wheeled into a room with a human centrifuge. The centrifuge was about 3 meters in radius, and they would lie down in the centrifuge and get spun at an equivalent of 1G. But that artificial gravity device, short arm human centrifuge, would generate a downward force, head to toe, of 1G on the body, to see if 30 minutes of that treatment a day would help mitigate the effects of bed rest on the gluteal muscles. And our conclusion was that it didn't. And there's a lot of explanation for that. And either I can speak about that now, or we can talk about it during our little debate.
Yeah, I think the first thing we should do is kind of so I like all my research is in bone, so I might be championing the bone flag in this debate, but so for that matter, Ryan and Vlad, as people that are both interested in space medicine but maybe doesn't have a horse in this fight, if you were to play, if
unbiased,
yeah, if you were to say like which one's more important for let's say long-term space travel, as a flight surgeon interested in promoting astronaut health, and you were to only pick one, which one would you think is more important?
Can I jump in first, Vlad?
Oh, by all means.
Sure. I'll take so here's what kind of my guess would be, but I think the answer to the question is obviously going to be it depends. But I think if I was to try to be a little bit more bold, I feel like if we're talking a long-term mission and your criterion for what's most important is by measuring how successful the mission would be, I would think that something like muscle atrophy might be more important in a place like the moon or Mars, where gravity isn't as big of a factor, and maybe fracture risk is smaller. Especially if some kind of muscle atrophy might impact the role of the astronaut's ability to do whatever their mission is when they're getting there after months of being in transit, or whatever setup it requires when they land. It seems like the bone thing is more of like, okay, it's not a problem unless there's an injury to the bone where you no longer can use that limb at all. But muscle might be more of a problem if I don't know, if you don't have like robots or something to set up your habitat or whatever, for instance. That's maybe my guess. Sitting here in planet Earth.
Mm-hmm. So we have one vote for muscle.
Sure. Yeah, I'll say that.
So with my very uneducated understanding of this incredibly complicated topic, I'm going to apply what I've learned with basic bone physiology and see how that kind of influences my decision here. I feel that with bone health, there comes an age, I think it's around age 40, where your bones begin to depreciate in growth, and they start to break down over time. The way you prevent that is you have to do a lot of bone kind of like health, a lot of weight-based exercise ahead of time to increase the density of the bone, so that you have a long amount, you have a reserve to kind of get you through the golden years of your life. And I feel like the same kind of philosophy can potentially apply to long-term space missions, because you're losing that gravity that would initially be there to help stimulate bone growth. And now that that's gone, you're going to have to depend on the exercise machines that are present in like the International Space Station or in the spaceships that you're using. And I feel like the muscles are a lot more easily adaptable to that if you partake in a rigorous exercise. Whereas bone health, I feel like that is going to be something that takes a lot more training and a lot more like nuanced focus on, and I don't think that would be potentially possible on a long-term space mission. So I'm throwing my lot in with the bone health. You got to have strong bone health going into a mission, whereas with your muscle health, there's a potential ability to increase its muscle strength. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think another thing is probably the more important question for us coming from a medical background would be how are these things going to affect the health of the astronauts? Not thinking about it more in like a mission success / failure way, but more in like, are astronauts like going to be healthy? Are they going to be okay when they are there? Are they going to be okay when eventually they come back? If that's part of what's going on. I like what you're saying, Vlad. But I'm not convinced.
I'm going to say I need to find. I need to cherry pick the data first before I solid.
It's even now, 2-2. I like it.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know about you two, but I kind of thought, about cheating the question a little bit. It's a fun question to say absolutely one or absolutely other, but I kind of wanted to look at kind of the crosstalk between the two. So if you were to train the muscle, have super large muscles, what does it do for bone? And if you have, stimulate bone growth, what does it do for muscle? Because there are some biological signaling that happens between the two tissues. So that's kind of how I looked at it. So if you could just train one, like what is the best, the strongest relationship to help the other one? So to kind of two birds with one stone it. So I actually have a couple articles that I won't go into super detail, but just wanted to kind of share kind of this crosstalk between the tissues on two spaceflight studies. So I'll go over to that right now. So right here we have, and I think you all can see this in the live YouTube recording. We're new to YouTube streaming, and it's really exciting to be live. And we have a couple chats that maybe in the future we can answer some questions live. But essentially, I'll start out from the bone to muscle kind of axis. And so one way to increase bone mass is to we lost one of our co-hosts.
Yeah,
maybe
she totally predicted that.
I know.
Yeah.
Very intelligent.
Looks like Vlad, on the YouTube, you have collapsed into yourself.
Oh, I have?
I think she might have hit the other.
I think she's coming back. I think it just takes a second. Man, I gotta say, it's really tough to just given like the 30-second spiel she gave about a research project. It's kind of tough to like focus on the debate instead of just like letting her talk more about it. It sounds so fascinating.
No,
That's really kind of you.
Oh, you back? Good, my
I'm here.
the timing is impeccable.
Yeah, I know.
She was always listening. Yeah.
You were saying?
Ryan was pretty much saying we want to hear we want to continue to talk to you about all your work, but let me just kind of explain the the muscle to bone, the bone to muscle axis. So so here I have an article that was published in 2020 in December that looked at how mechanical loading could help recover bone in the case of disuse. I think it was hind limb unloading that was used, but it didn't help really increase muscle. So it was kind of this. There are certain chemical signals or signals in the blood that are called myokines that can help increase muscle that are secreted by bone tissue, but it was kind of they weren't able to, at least in this study, able to see any increases in muscle mass. So it seems like the arrow of increasing bone mass does not really increase muscle mass that much. And then kind of another kind of famous, more well-known study done by several astronauts aboard the International Space Station looked at the role of myostatin, essentially a protein that inhibits muscle growth. They were able to knock out myostatin, and they called these the mighty mice. And the mice that these mice looked like they were just absolutely, they hit the gym every day. They were absolutely jacked with their muscle mass, and it did seem like they were able to increase both muscle and bone loss. So this really says like the arrow from muscle, both increases muscle mass, but is also able to increase bone density too. So just wanted to kind of lay that out and say, oh, if you're going to choose one, under that circumstance, you would want to target the muscle. So that was really what I wanted to kind of go over just quickly and give a nice biological kind of background and show two very recent articles that kind of look at the intersection of muscle and bone. Because it's called, musculoskeletal health, but maybe it should be skeletal-muscular health. Maybe which one comes first, right? But I guess I want to toss it back to you all with a couple questions. So for me, when I think about like mission success, I think about like kind of like in the emergency department, you think about those big flags, like what is going to kill the person in front of you, and almost all of those things, at least for me, are bone related. So in terms of having calcium, she doesn't want to hear my bone stuff. So she's just
bone stuff sucks.
Looks like she just keeps on hitting the.
I think you took it too far with the skeletal muscular thing.
Yeah.
What were you thinking?
Guys, I'm sorry. This is hospital Wi-Fi.
Hey, this is
I think my computer knows. My computer just knows if you offend it, if you make it sad, then it's gonna disconnect me.
Yeah, bone is more important. Bone is more important, and then it just shuts off.
I'm so sorry. I interrupt you at very important parts.
Oh, it's okay. This is all about fun and just and meeting new people in space medicine. So, just happy that you're here. But yeah, pretty much when I think of those things in the emergency department that's going to kill someone, I think of you think of calcium. Calcium dysregulation even by a little bit will kill someone. You think about kidney stones as a result of hypercalciuria and hypercalcemia. You think about long bone fractures. You think about all these bone stuff. So I kind of think of it as, well, maybe bone is the most important tissue, but the way that you get better bone, if you were to focus on one or the other, is actually through the muscle. So I don't know. I just kind of think of those big red flags of kidney stones, long bone fractures, kind of those big red flags in terms of why my vote goes to bone being more important. But I'm kind of curious on what you all think.
I think something that kind of pops into my head is, I think you can also kind of take this direction with muscle injury when you talk about things like when you're talking about ion regulation getting out of whack, and as you were saying all that, I just started to wonder about whether or not any type of muscle atrophy that you experience from being in space for too long would kind of increase your risk for a serious muscle injury that potentially change the levels of proteins and ions in your blood. But I don't think I've read or heard of anything about that related to just the space station. On the other hand, I don't know that they do anything. I'm willing to bet that the most strenuous part of their job is besides like the hand and finger stuff that they're doing in the spacewalks, is the actual exercise that they do. And I don't know if on a mission to like create a facility on the moon or Mars or some other place might require more human labor or not.
Yeah, that's.
I think a lot of it will be done by autonomous vehicles
True.
for safety reasons. Sorry, Vlad.
No, yeah, I was gonna say it's just to echo that point. It's gonna really depend on how the missions are gonna be structured. But then on the other hand, sure, a lot of these missions will be structured with autonomous vehicles, but on the other hand, you might want to think about what could happen to those autonomous vehicles. Would we want to just depend on autonomous vehicles alone to handle the heavy labor that we're doing? Because I know there's, at least listen to the those wind sounds on Mars, seems like a pretty clear situation where, there could be gunk getting stuck up in machines where we're going to have to do things on ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Agree. I'm just going to charge my AirPods. Hang on.
Yeah, go for it.
No problem.
One thing that also kind of comes to mind, in choosing either muscle or bone, really is the rate of decay and the rate of regrowth, or the rate of gain. And so, at least to my knowledge, a lot of space medicine studies that I've looked at in terms of bone have shown that you lose about 1 or 2% of your bone density in critical areas like the femoral neck and spine in about 1 to 2% a month. And this is about equivalent to about 6 months to a year of postmenopausal osteoporosis. So this is pretty severe osteoporosis, and the actual downward trajectory of how low you can get is pretty unclear. Not really sure if it's going to plateau out and reach a new steady state, or if it just continues to drop. I mean, I would guess it would reach steady state at some point. But once you lose a couple percent bone mass, you are, in a very serious way at a fragility fracture risk. Mm-hmm. But I'm not really sure what the muscle literature is in terms of, in the case of unloading, maybe a part of your study, Vienna, did you see that people kind of reached a new steady state?
Okay, so let me advocate for muscle a little bit here. Your question, did they reach a steady state? We only measured before and after, so we only used 2 time points, so we didn't see what the trend was. And to my knowledge, there isn't any steady state. If you think about people on Earth who lose muscle and suffer muscle atrophy, you can go anywhere from bodybuilder to very, very cachectic and frail and legs this big. You can be anywhere on that continuum, and there's not a point where you just flatline. You can always keep going further and further down. You can be very cachectic but still have your bones. And so in terms of what's more important to address, as long as you don't fracture your bones, you'll always have your bones because your body is constantly doing calcium homeostasis. Our muscles are not only a source of force generation, but it's also a source of fuel, source of glucose. We get stores of glucose from our liver, our fats, our muscles, and the glucose in our blood. And so it actually stores very important fuel for us. And when we are starving, when we're malnourished, then the body takes from the muscles, and that's why people who are impoverished have very, very little muscle, but they still have their bone. So in that view, it's very important to keep our muscles going, not only for generating forces and mobilizing, but also to provide a source of respiration and metabolism to keep your body going and to store the food that you're eating. I'm looking at an image here. There was a Mir/shuttle mission of 4 to 7 weeks duration, and the loss of muscle, like bone, I assume, the loss of muscle depends on where it is in the body. With microgravity, on Earth, we are loaded most on our feet, the lower we go down in our body, the greater the gravity, because we're holding the rest of our body up. And so I'm reading that the loss of muscle volume during that 7-week mission in weightlessness in the back was 11%, in the thigh was 12%, and in the calf it was 20%. And some of the literature that I've read in my honors research verifies that gradient. And so the gluteal muscles would probably be around the 11 to 12% in 7 weeks, just 7 weeks. That's nearly 2 months. It takes at least probably 6 to 9 months to go to Mars at closest approach. So if we allow that gradient to continue, it will just continue. It probably wouldn't reach any plateau. So there's that, and of course it's not just journeys to Mars, but it can be long stays on the ISS. I think the guy who spent the longest time on the ISS, which was Russian, of course, he spent over a year continuously on the ISS, and he didn't suffer any fractures. No fracture has ever been recorded in space, actually.
You're not going to fall on anything, right?
You're not going to fall on anything. The problem is when you get back, or if say there's a big acceleration somewhere, like, I can't think of anything right now. If something falls on you, if you have a workplace accident, even then, like, nothing can fall on you if you're in space. It's when you return to a gravity body, whether that be the moon or Mars or back to Earth. I don't know of any fractures that have occurred shortly after arrival on Earth, but I can see fractures are very viable on Mars, especially when people are exerting heavy loads, building and things like that. They're more risky jobs. No fractures ever happen in space, but muscle atrophy happens all the time. So Kyle, what say you?
I would say fracture isn't the right metric. I would say the right metric would be loss of bone density, just as loss of muscle tone and muscle size is kind of would be more analogous to loss of bone mass. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, the gradient was you lost more as you went more inferior, right? Like more towards your feet. It's actually about the same in bone. And I think it's just because, essentially we're so used to, like, all of our body is meant to propel us around and fight gravity. And a lot of that heavy lifting is literally done by the lower limbs. And so you definitely lose a lot more mass in the lower limbs than kind of actually towards your head. I think there was one figure from a paper where they actually reported increases in cranial bone mass because of they're kind of moving their head around, and so I thought that was kind of interesting. It also might be attributed to this cephalic fluid shift, where you have fluids and blood that carry out growth factors and nutrient supply and all that. It's kind of being shut off from the lower limbs. So I think the kind of interplay between those two could be quite interesting.
So
but yeah,
what you're saying, Kyle, is the risk of a fracture to your head is going down. I think that's a plus in the muscle camp being more important. That's what you're saying.
I guess, like, for long duration space missions, not going back to a gravity well, I still think that bone mass is, are these astronauts that are never going to come back though? Like they're gonna go to some gravity well eventually. Like I think that's, I don't think we can sustain. I don't think someone can live indefinitely in microgravity. I don't know if that's the case, right? So
you're also at extreme risk for all this ionizing radiation.
Mm-hmm. Which I know is definitely a factor in embrittling bone, making bone more brittle. So being on the surface of Mars, already at low density, having this radiation that might be making your bones more brittle. It actually changes, like, the collagen structure of bone. So it could be, I don't know. I think bone it's more of the thing that'll kill you. And I think muscle will help bone get stronger, like more bone mass. But I don't think there's a thing. I don't think there's a is there a case that muscle wasting would kill you faster than bone loss, like hypercalcemia or long bone fracture would kill you faster than muscle loss?
In terms of bone weakness, muscle weakness killing you, I don't think it would necessarily kill you, except for the fact that your muscles are intimately linked to your cardiovascular system. Your muscles are the things, say that you've got muscles around your veins in your leg that help pump the blood back up to your heart. And if those muscles down there are not working, then you get retrograde pressure in your venous system, and heart failure and generally cardiovascular disease, pulmonary edema, for example, also are some of the biggest killers in at least Australia and probably other developed countries. I think muscles are important because they are intimately linked to many other different systems, including the metabolic system, as I told you, with fuel, and also now the cardiovascular system. Our blood vessels cannot work without muscles. Yes, bones are vascular, but bones are vascular because they release factors into the cardiovascular system, which is then propelled by muscle movement. And we think about let's say spaceflight is a process of aging, because it has been shown to be so. And
can you guys hear right now?
I think the audio dropped for you for a second.
I wonder if her earbuds or something ran out of battery or whatever she was using.
What?
Oh, we can hear you again. Nice.
You're back.
Good. So is you know how you said that fractures aren't the best metric? I don't think killing is the best metric either. What about quality of life? If we have weak muscles. My mum's got a disability where she's got weak muscles, and her quality of life is significantly worse because of that. And I see that in the people the patients that I have. I'm on geriatrics right now, so lots and lots of old people with lots of muscle wasting, and they have their bones, and most of them don't have osteoporosis. They've got pretty good bones for their age, but their muscles have wasted, and they can't do as much. They need physiotherapy input. They need mobility aids. They can't complete the activities of daily living as well as a normal person could. And so muscle weakness is a massive issue in aging, and therefore would be a massive issue in space flight when we send people to Mars.
Yeah,
I did want to echo that as well, because bones on their own, they're not going to help develop the density that is necessary to ensure that you're not getting any of those fractures that you're talking about that will result in somebody's death. You need the muscles there to help do the loading, to weight movement, to get the bones to physiologically start growing again. And in long spaceflight travels, I thought it was kind of elucidating to hear, Vienna, how there hasn't been any fractures that you've known of in space in those circumstances. And that makes a lot of sense, because you're not really moving heavy weight. You're not really loading anything heavy on you, because you have the benefit of no gravity. Well, gravity in the sense that there's nothing like a massive celestial body putting it onto you. But if we go into Mars, however, where the gravity is far less than that of Earth, but you're still going to have some kind of weight loading. I mean, you're gonna have interplay between making sure that your muscles are strong enough to move weight, but also ensuring that your bones are strong enough to carry that weight to begin with. I'm thinking about people with osteoporosis who get those pathological fractures just from sitting in cars driving around. You can totally see driving around in a Mars buggy, then hitting a bump at the wrong point, and now you have some kind of a spinal fracture. So I don't know. I mean, hearing this really in-depth conversation, it's really making me think that you got to have this interplay of both.
Yeah.
Kyle,
Good.
Kyle, can I ask you a question? I think earlier, it sounded to me like you were trying to make the argument earlier on that muscle loss is something that can be mitigated, while bone loss is less so. Was that a point that you were trying to make, or was that just something that I imagined you trying to say?
So the points I was trying to make with the papers was really my way, if I were to choose just one tissue for an intervention, for an exercise or some kind of medical intervention, which one would I choose to kind of get both to work? Which like what the interplay between the two. If I were to, make really big muscles, what does that do to bone? If I were to increase the bone mass, what does that do to muscle? And it appears to me that the muscle to bone axis is much stronger. That the even passive forces, people that there's a lot of studies on bone density for baseball pitchers, where they just do active throwing, and they can actually substantially increase their bone density in their dominant arm rather than their non-throwing arm. And so this is essentially there's no gravitational or less of a gravitational force, and yet still you're able to, just by biomechanics and muscle loading, you're able to cause bone building. So that was really my way to say, I think bone is it is the foundation of our locomotion and is the foundation for what the muscles act against to move us around and to maybe build a Martian colony. But maybe the best way to get the bone mass higher is to actually focus on the muscle, if I were to only choose one. So that was kind of my setup. So as a result, I would choose muscle, but not for muscle. I would do it for bone. So that's the way that I thought about it.
Have your cake and eat it moment, I see.
Yeah, exactly. So I would choose muscle, but not for muscle. Because I think that the bone side of things is just, it's a little more compelling in terms of like, it is just the foundation for what the muscles work on. So almost by definition, it should come first. But I obviously love this discussion, and it actually brings up a good point. Some conferences I've gone to, they're really interested. It's a debate in the field. That sarcopenia is like a term that's used at diagnoses, and then there's a term called osteosarcopenia. So that this really brings up the interaction between these two tissues, and it's not like, some people aren't happy with these terms yet, because they like it's binning these tissues and their interactions in ways that don't quite fit, and so finding the terminology to make everyone happy is still an ongoing process, which means that this is like a ongoing debate, this kind of interaction between the two, because we're kind of dealing with a sarcopenic condition, we're kind of dealing with an osteoporotic condition, but really how do those interact? And it's just an ongoing thing. So I think it's all interesting.
Medical terminology is very interesting. They didn't call it myopenia; they called it sarcopenia.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure that word root for sarcopenia with sarco, like sarcophagus, like a body, a being, penia meaning less or few. So what sarcopenia really is, from my understanding, is what happens as one ages, or when the degeneration of the body as a whole. I think that's what the description of sarcopenia is, and it's only usually specifically used for aging or people who, who have very weak, like pathologically weak bodies. Yeah, I find it interesting that they didn't call it myopenia, and you think, why didn't they do that? And so they had to add in osteo to specify that it's bones and the rest of the body. But because, of course, with aging, it's not just the muscles that are lost, everything that starts to degenerate and decondition. And so sarcopenia is a good term to describe that. Yeah, but maybe osteosarcopenia has a more of a bone component to it. I don't know. Yeah,
it's like, are they two different conditions, or is it, with your patients on the geriatric floor, they're sarcopenic, but they have no osteoporosis. So is that a different condition than one where you have muscle loss and you have bone loss too? Like, I think that is it's a big gray area. So I think, a lot of people, they talk about space medicine, or they hear the word space medicine and they think it's only for astronauts. But really, if we're able to kind of, the learnings that we can get from space medicine apply to diseases and pathologies that affect most everyone a part of their lifespan. So I think it's a really unique lens to put to it, and hopefully we'll be able to tease apart these different conditions.
Absolutely, and one of the reasons that our project got funding was because, of course, we have to demonstrate the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. Space medicine is very hard to me, it's hard to get funding for. And if you imagine yourself as a guy who gives out grants and funding, then you're going to give it to the group that is going to do the most good and have the most impact. So the people who created our project had to fight for the fact that it could benefit people on Earth as well. For example, if we did find that artificial gravity could, in terms of a centrifuge, could help people rehabilitate their muscles in a way that they couldn't otherwise. For example, people who are bedbound, they can just lie in a centrifuge and get and get rehabilitated rather than having to stand up and walk and put themselves at risk. And aside from that, the MRIs that we got were very useful because we could see the pattern, the progression of fat accumulation and the progression of atrophy that occurred before and after. So we can better understand at an MRI level, which is pretty much the gold standard, what happens to these muscles during long periods of bed rest. These bed rest studies are very expensive, and therefore the data from them is very valuable and hard to come by. And you think, like, why study healthy participants in bed, and why don't we just get them from hospital and study the guys in hospital? It's because they already have confounding conditions, and they already have things going on with them that are extraneous variables messing up the data. So we need to have healthy participants do these studies. But you can see how logistically challenging that is, but also how useful it is, and how much it saves compared to sending people to space to do this research. So we really rely on analog studies to do a lot of our space medicine, and that's where our connection with Earth is too.
Yeah, I think one thing that came to mind when you talked about using healthy participants, I think there's still an ongoing debate whether or not like a disease pathology is the same, like putting a normal person, a quote unquote normal person, in an environment where it causes a certain disease pathology is the same as the disease pathology that it like mirrors. So is a healthy participant with this environmental condition the same as someone with the actual disease? I don't think it's kind of a more of an existential question for medicine to really handle, but I think it is something that is kind of unanswered in kind of what you brought up.
It's also an ethical question. Do you really want to put people who have kind of non-pathological conditions, put them in environments that would stimulate some kind of a pathological condition? Is that something that you want to do?
I'm going to answer your question first, Vlad, and then I'll go back to Kyle's point. Do we want to put them in pathological conditions? Well, we do that all the time. We wouldn't have a COVID vaccine, which I got last week, if we didn't test them. If we didn't test them on healthy participants. Almost every clinical trial and drug trial of any sort, and medical research too, requires putting healthy participants in a position they wouldn't otherwise be and putting them at risk of compromising their health. However, we do that in a very, very small incremental fashion, and we do it in the safest and most ethical way possible, where we monitor them and obtain their consent and allow them to withdraw and put these measures in place so that we minimize that risk of doing the unethical thing. So I think that that's a very common occurrence to put people in those sorts of positions. And as long as we aim to do no harm and give the person their autonomy, then I think we've minimized the unethical harm there. In terms of Kyle's point with putting someone in an environment, like let's say we've got a healthy normal person, or what environment constitutes a disease state? You can, divers and people who have climbed Mount Everest, they have been put in challenging environments. People who have gone on 200-kilometer runs 200-mile runs.
Thank you.
They are they in a pathological or disease state? And people who go to space, do you call every astronaut a diseased person? And I don't think that is, because I think how I define disease is the imbalance of homeostasis. It's when the body can't cope with the environment you've put them in. With the people I've just described, the body does adjust itself and adapt itself to the new environment and still maintain homeostasis. People who are unwell, people who go to hospital, are those that have not been able to maintain that balance. And our job as doctors is to restore homeostasis. One of the first things that I learned in first year medical school. So I think we can think of it in that way. And then again, you think of like it's the bounds of disease are starting to change, because can it be not just biological but also psychosocial? If somebody feels that they are unwell, even though their body is not even if their body is in perfect homeostasis, if your quality of life is bad and you're suffering emotionally or socially or psychologically, are you diseased too? That's another thing we can talk about on a different day that is not with MSK.
I was going to try to figure out a clever way to loop back to the discussion. I couldn't come up with one, so I'll just come right at you guys. And this is something we've discussed previously a few times, I think, but the idea of taking a more precision medicine angle at this, I think one factor that we haven't really discussed at all in our debate so far is just the fact that whether muscle or bone is going to be problematic is also something that probably is going to depend largely on the individual astronaut, right? And something, at least when Kyle was talking about earlier with postmenopausal women, and then comparing bone loss in space to that, I was starting to think, oh man, so what you're telling me is it's going to be really challenging to be an astronaut if I'm a postmenopausal woman. And so I don't know, I think I don't know if I can come up with an example as easily for the muscle side of things, but I'm sure that there's probably a host of age-related muscle issues that you could point to and say like, oh, we need to have this in mind for this specific astronaut as well. Do you guys have any thoughts or anything related to that? So I think personally, I just think it might come down to the individual.
There's definitely a trend in selecting for a more diverse range of astronauts. Back when people first started going to space, they would obviously only select men and people who were fit, and they'd go through these rigorous testings. And the same with the military, actually, where we only select for pilots who are very, very fit and well and such. Mm-hmm. And both the military and the space industries, we used to have both exclusion and inclusion criteria. So you can join if you have this inclusion criteria, or you can't join if you have this. That's exclusion criteria. And now we're starting to do away with the exclusion criteria. One of them that I know being you used to not be able to fly if you wore glasses, or if you had any sort of visual acuity impairment at all. But now you can wear glasses as a pilot. So less exclusion criteria means you're excluding less people. In considering more people, and hopefully that would mean a more diverse range of ages and genders and bodies going into space. And that, again, that would definitely mean more jobs for us if you want to go into space medicine, because we'll have to not only know what to do for the fit and well, but the people of all different types, and would have to apply medicine to them. And that's what I find space medicine so exciting. It's because it's basically you'll have to know everything for everyone, but in a space context. And yes, I agree that relates to muscles and how older people with less muscle mass, what can you put them through, and what sort of unloading can you give them for them to be able to go to space? And then
that leads to space tourism, because space tourism is going to be a reality, and people of all ages will want to go to space just to be in space, and there's going to be regulations around that. Hopefully, space law will be able to keep up. But it's talking very generally now, and we've gotten off topic.
It's the point of a podcast, so we're just happy to hear what you have on your mind and what everyone what they're interested in, what they have to share. So, go ahead.
And if people think that space doesn't affect you, if people think that space doesn't affect the everyday person, whack them with the space tourism argument, because it is going to happen. Like, there are spaceports on Earth right now. People have gone privately to the ISS. We just haven't seen it on the news. It has happened. It costs a lot now, but it's going to become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, just as, aviation has, commercial flights have. And then it will soon be a normal occurrence to say, hey, I'm going to space for a week. See you later. See you when I get back. And yeah, and then what are the risks you take with that, and how much regulation should be around that?
Yeah, I think part of the kind of bring it back to the muscle and bone thing. You brought up space law and risks. One thing that's kind of perplexing the bone field is really, you lose bone density in space, even with preventative measures like exercise and stuff like that. And it's not sure how long, like, we haven't had astronauts that have gone to space either for significant periods of time, or we haven't been able to follow them up for the amount of time that they would otherwise normally experience a fracture on Earth. And so there's a big question mark, as we follow these astronauts up, because if you look at the data now, a lot of astronauts are they have not experienced a fracture or some kind of pathological condition as a result of spaceflight, but maybe that's just because we haven't observed them for long enough. And so from a risk standpoint, if we figure out that this is still a risk, that 20 or 30 years down the road, that you develop some condition that lays the risk scenario from a legal standpoint in kind of weird water, kind of strange uncharted territory, that you have some percentage risk of having a fracture after going to space for 6 months or trying to live on Mars, but do you just sign it away and it's all over, or how does that work? And are there any long-term follow-up studies from muscle that is there any significant risk for muscle in kind of that same way? Just kind of curious if anyone has any comments.
I don't know if so I don't have a direct response to that. Vlad, did you have something?
I was just gonna say, I just wanted to add into the fact that not only does this apply to space tourism, but to all other industries that are going to be involved in space, either mining or energy development, research, establishing infrastructure on other planets, celestial bodies, what have you. So, I mean, it's that idea of risk and kind of entering uncharted territory is definitely something that's going to be discussed, and I'm pessimistic about it. I feel like we're just going to sign it off and say, hey, what's going to happen? Best of luck to you. If anything bad happens, we'll write an OSHA chapter on it. But I know it's hard to say.
Yeah, I hope that's not the case.
I think the expansion of our technology or our ability to do stuff is going to well outpace the legal standpoint, and I think that's been a problem in a lot of different fields, like medical ethics and technology. That's a classic case where you develop something like ECMO, and it's able to help patients with certain in these conditions that stabilizes them and keeps them alive. But now you have to how do you deal with them at that point? And so as we're able to develop these technologies, really how to deal with that from a legal standpoint as well as a moral ethical standpoint is murky. So yeah, this is all really interesting.
Yeah, and in terms of what you said, Kyle, about when people come back from space and they have a risk of developing fractures, or in the case of muscles, sarcopenia, or muscle atrophy. Once people get back to space, they go through a couple of weeks of reconditioning, and then they just get on with their lives. And from a scientific standpoint, once you've established calcium homeostasis again, and you're able to, can you recover lost bone density? To some extent, I'm sure you'd be able to recover the bone and muscle that you lost in space. Once you've done that, then I don't see where the risk is where you'd be developing a fracture 20 years later. If you're going to fracture yourself, it's within the 2 weeks of reconditioning, not after that. That's what I think, but again, we don't know enough about space medicine to be able to tell. I do know that you know that how the government tells you like you should drink your milk and then when you're a kid so that you can build strong and healthy bones. Yeah. I can't remember this. You might know this, but up to a certain age, your bones are still developing, and once you reach full skeletal maturity, and if you lose bone density, can you get it back, or can you build more bone density? I don't know. Can you? Yeah. Can you recover it, or once you've lost it?
Yeah. So under normal conditions, bone density, is gradually increased until around the age of, I think it's 28 to about 35. A lot of people reach what's quote unquote called peak bone mass, and that's when that's when your skeleton is most dense. That's it, plainly. And then over time, there are age-related losses of bone density, kind of like muscle. Like you get loss of muscle tone and increases in fatty infiltration. But for bone density, you pretty much have a steady decrease, and it might go into the personalized medicine of things where each individual has a different slope. And it's actually pretty hard to change the negative slope of a person going through osteoporosis or someone who's losing significant bone mass. And actually, one way that it was phrased to me was that osteoporosis isn't a loss of bone, but it's a failure to have gained a significant peak bone mass. So really what that's getting to is that it's really hard to change your downslope, and really you want to make significant gains as you're developing and growing and into your early adulthood, because it's very hard to kind of make bone density significantly increase over time.
Yeah,
if you make
I have a lot of work to do in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
Please.
Bone mass.
Yeah,
So
and I think this
under normal conditions, is this someone who isn't engaging in weight training?
Yeah, so you bring up another good point. I think if you were to subject someone to a new exercise routine or weight training or weightlifting, or there are actually some studies out there of using vibrational techniques to increase bone density instead of an actual exercise. So it's like a vibrational padding or some kind of thing that you stand on that actually like vibrates you. I think that you definitely can increase bone mass in that regard. But I guess I was talking like over of a person's whole lifespan.
Yeah.
That's kind of
yeah. I'm wondering if you're consistently doing like squats and deadlifts, for example, had some heavy weight on your back, or that you're lifting up from the ground, that's going to have a significant impact on the density loss over time.
Yeah, actually, there was a study recently that came out that looked at astronauts that were going to the International Space Station, and it trained different pre-flight, or it looked at different pre-flight parameters, and it actually showed that pre-flight running volume, like the amount of running that you did pre-flight, actually puts you at a significant risk of losing bone density during your time in space. So really, your ability to maintain your exercise regime, whatever it is really what this article was trying to argue. that if you try and train up your upslope for bone density or muscle mass, could be really great, and you could start off at a greater peak, but you actually lose it faster.
Huh.
So
that makes sense, I guess. Your body hasn't really like adapted physiologically. I know this is like kind of mystical mumbo jumbo here that I'm talking about, but maybe you kind of have to develop that homeostasis that we've been talking about first with constant physical activity over like a X period amount of time. How long that is, still needs to be elucidated.
Previously, Kyle and I joked about sending deconditioned people
into
space, since that it would be less of a shot.
They're already mechano-adapted. It's fine, right? Just couch potatoes up in space would be great.
That's so interesting.
But actually, this brings me into a good follow-up, where I have a tweet pulled up of someone who's also in the space medicine community and hopefully could come on the show later. Tess Morris Patterson, and I think it'll come up for you guys in a second on YouTube. But essentially, there's just like this device she's developing, and it allows people to jump in space. To be able to cause mechanical loads on the bone and to do essentially just jumping exercises. And so I think you guys can. It's just this person who's jumping on this apparatus, and this apparatus is like, it's actually pretty compact. So this device was developed to fit into smaller space capsules and smaller areas rather than the ARED and the other kind of treadmills and other things that are on the International Space Station that might be too bulky for a space capsule bound for Mars. And so this this kind of exercise equipment might be really, really important for success in terms of musculoskeletal health in both bone and muscle, not just bone.
Yeah, that's so cool. This is really making me question the difference between like doing a squat versus jumping. What is the physiological difference between the two of those, and what advantages and disadvantages are present in either exercise?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of research on jump rope. So actually, I have my jump rope right here. But jump rope is really good at increasing bone mass. And there's actually a lot of studies that were done in terms of how frequently you do it, and how often you do it, and it's really good. And it's definitely a great exercise and definitely one to consider. Deadlifts are definitely also really good, especially for hip. Like, hip BMD. I'm sure the muscle people love deadlifts, but it seems to be really good if you do them correctly.
Yeah.
Big if.
I think that I agree with all of those points, and to me, like, it depends on how jumping versus squatting, they're different on the micro level, but I can't remember how. Obviously, with jumping, you're doing it in a much shorter time, and so you're exerting. If you think of momentum, P is F over T, that's force over time. Then, if you're jumping, you're exerting. You're doing it over a short time, but it's a big force, I think. Small time.
Like impulse is like force and time.
Impulse is force and time, not momentum, right?
Yeah, that's something like that.
Impulse.
I'm remembering that baseball glove, capturing the baseball.
Yeah.
That exercise.
Yeah, so you're doing it over a short time, whereas with a deadlift you're doing it over a longer time, and it depends on how heavy you're lifting as well. The other thing is, I think with lifting, you're having to hold. It's kind of isometric, but not. It's like deadlifts are more isometric than jumping is, because jumping is plyometric, which means you're exerting then releasing, because while you're in the air you're not doing anything. And then you're back down and jumping and then releasing, so you're not doing anything again. Whereas when you're doing your deadlift, from the bottom of your deadlift to the top of your deadlift, you're constantly inputting neuromuscularly you constantly need signals, and you're constantly having to concentrate on doing that, and that has different effects on the musculature as well as your neurological input, which is why I think passive studies with vibration and such, and artificial gravity is passive because you're not doing anything, you're letting it do it for you. They only solve part of the problem. I think we need resisted exercise when you're actually thinking about the exercise and telling your muscles to do something with your brain. I think that has a very important role in maintaining muscle and bone mass. If we don't have that neuromuscular input, then we won't know what to do with it in emergencies where we need to actually work them.
I love how you bring up that point. That's so like a big point in like powerlifting or any kind of like heavy weightlifting, is you need to kind of train the different nerves in your body to be efficient and activating your muscles. It's not simply that your muscles are strong enough, but you need to be efficient and also how you're moving those weight. Yeah. Otherwise, you're just gonna collapse with all that weight on your back, no matter how strong your muscles are.
So I wanted to ask Vienna and Kyle if you feel like something such as this jumping apparatus was available for a long-term mission to Mars, for instance. Do you think this would, can either of you, I guess, agree on, or can both of you agree rather, that maybe bone would be more of a problem if you had some kind of way to train like this the whole time? Or do you think that both bone and muscle would be equally losses would be equally mitigated by having something like this? Because I guess some context behind the question before you answer is just the fact that I've heard previously, and I don't know if either of you or if any of you guys have, that some astronauts actually come back to Earth with, instead of muscle atrophy, they gain muscle because they're exercising more when they're on the ISS. And it seems like something like this, if you could fit it into a spaceship, during travel, maybe you would hit Mars with more muscle than potentially you left with.
And then your bones break down because they've atrophied over time.
Hey, is that a vote for me or what? Is that a vote for me?
I don't know. You shot yourself in the foot when you were talking about how the muscles were the ones that were mitigating the bone growth.
Oh, but just forget about that. That didn't happen.
Muscle bad, bone good.
Yeah. That's what orthopedic surgeons think, so.
Yeah. That's so funny. In terms of having that exercise device, okay, with the way that she's testing it on Earth, I can see that the tweet says that she is testing it on Earth and then she has to go into parabolic flight to test it there. Because unfortunately what actually happens is when you're doing analogs on Earth where you're trying to reduce the axial load of gravity, axial means from head to toe, and right now I've got an axial load. If I lie down, I'm simply changing the axis of gravity to be sagittal, I think it would be coronal or sagittal. Coronal. I'm simply changing the plane over which it acts. It's only through parabolic flight or being in actual space where you've eliminated gravity in all axes. And so when you're testing that instrument on Earth, like she's doing in the GIF or the video, then she's still got gravity on her. Her muscles are not as much, but her muscles are they still know that gravity is there. If she did that on parabolic flight, it would feel very, very different, even though she's in the same position. There's no gravity field at all in space, in any plane. So it actually does feel different. It's not a reliable analog in that sense. And so
the idea is that in this case, since the gravity is always pushing you down towards the bed, your body and your muscles are kind of orientating to that. Whereas if you're in like parabolic flight, the forces are all acting in different ways, and you're kind of just like wobbling in space as opposed to kind of going down.
Yeah, you don't know which way is up. Like when you're lying down, you know which way is up. Therefore, you know which way is sideways, and therefore you know where to press your feet to do the jump. But when you're in space, actually that's another thing. Your neurovestibular system gets very, very confused, and that's the source of a lot of nausea and probably a lot of distress for the astronauts too. just not knowing where you are, not knowing how to orientate yourself or perform proprioception. And again, that leads us to talk about the neuromuscular connection, and how important it is to be able to sense where you are before you do the action.
Gotcha. So that explains why cats kind of are thrashing about in parabolic flight when you let them go.
It's so interesting. There were so Skylab was essentially a hollowed out Saturn V core, one of the fuel tanks or one of the core stages, and it allowed for a very significant volume for people to do the early space medicine kind of studies. And I think that they did have a couple experimental animals up there. I just remember seeing a cat in microgravity, like spinning around. Or maybe it could have been a parabolic flight, I'm not sure. But it was trying to find like how to land because of how they like, alter their center of gravity and kind of do their rotational management. I thought it was really funny to look at, but you think about it and it's this exact question. How we orient ourselves into our space and how our kind of body responds, both from a neurovestibular sense, but also a muscular sense too. And
if I, on my side, then we know, we learn in high school that the brain controls the muscles which control the limbs. There is no connection between the brain and the bone. There isn't.
Ooh, actually, it's kind of interesting because... What's that?
There's no active connection. So the muscle, it may be, there are nerves in the bone, sure, but there's no active connection that tells us. See, I can't wiggle my ears because there's no bones in my ears, but some people can wiggle their ears and I don't know why. It's probably because there's muscles in the ears somewhere that is an anatomical variation. I can't wiggle my teeth. My teeth, like, they're bones, right? I can't wiggle them because there's no muscle. Everything that moves in.
If you could.
Yeah. Well, I guess in terms of
bone processing center in the brain,
Yeah. It is interesting you say that. You're completely right. There's no. I guess I just have a hard time saying the word active because in the case of spinal cord injury, in the case of nerve ablation or nerve dissection, that does not touch any muscle, you can actually, like, deinnervation of nerve that is going to bone causes bone loss. So there is you don't do a voluntary action towards it, but there is a connection between the brain and the bone that does it is important. It's not maybe active in the traditional sense, but that's the one thing I have to say about that.
As an astronaut, I can't change that. If I deinnervate, then I can't do anything about that. But I can strengthen my muscles.
Mm-hmm.
I have control over my muscles and not my bones.
So
but I can have control of my bones via my muscles.
Mm-hmm.
This is where Vlad comes in with the new research of like some kind of injection for re-innervating bones and muscles. This is the hope. Yeah.
Vlad, I wanted to ask you if anything, since you and I are the impartial deciding votes here, do you think anything that you've heard so far has kind of swayed you more towards bone or muscle being more problematic in this context of space travel?
What I would say is that I'm more confused about my position. Primarily because I think what was really elucidating, especially what Vienna said about space travel, right, and not getting fractures in space, it's really now it's more of a contextual thing. Sure, in space travel, that's far different than being on a planet that has a far lighter gravitational force than that of Earth, right? So if we're in space travel, maybe it's more the muscles that are incredibly important, right, because of the cardiovascular health, because of the lymphatic and circulatory system. Whereas when you go on Mars, I mean, your bones are not going to be as conditioned as they would be on Earth, and so when you try to, say, lift a broken droid or rover of some sort, you end up snapping your back because your muscles are conditioned and they're putting that force on the bone, but your bones haven't been appropriately trained to handle that kind of weight in that specific context.
I'll chalk that up as a vote for bone. Let's go.
I think
It's harder to make your bone mass greater, right? It's easier to gain muscle bulk than bone mass, right?
I feel like it depends on where where are we putting the finish line here, because I think I agree with Vienna in that the muscle loss is more of a problem for quality of life as an end goal, but the bone loss issue seems more of a problem in an emergency context.
But definitely not just in an emergency context, right? Like, people get pathological fractures all the time from just sitting or hitting a bump on a car.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And this isn't a 100% support for the fact that bones are the most important thing.
No.
Situation. And I really appreciated that quality of life situation as well. Like, not being able to move around in a comfortable way, your joints are all in pain because your muscles aren't able to stabilize the patella, for example. Like, those are significant things that need to be accounted for. Probably much more likely than having some kind of shipping container fall on you.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of emergencies and bones, I was in an emergency department for 6 weeks this year, and we'd probably get a bone thing once a day at most. Most of the kids that came in had abdominal pain or other things that were wrong with them, but bone things, and this might be different at different hospitals, say hospitals closer to a major highway or hospitals closer to a major work site. You get more fractures there. Not all fractures are emergencies either. You would have to have a seriously displaced open fracture with bones sticking out of your skin for it to gain the attention of doctors within an hour. Otherwise, if you've just had a fracture, depending on where you are, you can get it fixed in a greater amount of time. And in terms of other emergencies, what about rhabdomyolysis? It's a medical emergency of the bone. We also use our muscles for I guess, maintaining homeostasis. People with COPD or lung disease, they need the muscles in their thorax to be able to cough and to be able to maintain their airways and take deep breaths in and out. And there's probably a bone involvement in there too. Your ribs, of course, your ribs act as that what do you call it? Like a bag or like a container to change the pressure inside your thorax. But of course, you've got muscles on your ribs as well, your intercostal muscles that help with the breathing. So it all works together, and I guess that's why they call it the musculoskeletal system.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're just debating whether it should be musculoskeletal or skeletal muscular.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
It rolls off the tongue, right? Actually, it doesn't at all. So, but I actually think one of the if I were you, Vienna, the ace up my sleeve would be the heart's a muscle. That's the golden ticket. The heart deconditioning and all of that associated increase in sphericity, like how spherical your heart is. The kind of how that interacts with the pulmonary system, that would just be I would have used that to be, muscle, like, look at this muscle that keeps you alive every second of the day,
However, that muscle is far different from the muscles brachioradialis or the quadriceps.
Yep.
Which is why I didn't go there, because if I went there, then Kyle would correct me with exactly the same thing.
I was just waiting. I was waiting. Oh, that's not the right metric. Oh, that's not the right muscle. What are we talking about here? Yeah.
We've got 3 types of muscles in our body. We've got gluteal muscle, which is what we're actually talking about, and we've got smooth muscle, which is in our arteries that squeeze our arteries and other parts of our body that do more automatic things, and then we have cardiac muscle, which is special muscle around the heart. And of course, there's a reason why when we talk about the musculoskeletal system, there's a separate system called the cardiovascular system that is just completely different innovation, different problems. But it's a really interesting point, because your heart muscle also atrophies in space because it doesn't need to work as hard to pump the blood to the essential organs up here, because there's already blood up here. in space. And so your heart becomes more spherical in shape and it gets smaller.
But I know, at least in the context of Earth gravity, that's technically kind of a good thing. You want your heart to be as efficient as possible, so that the cells aren't using as little energy as possible to provide as much nutrition, blood flow to your organs. Otherwise, you're getting hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and you're predisposing yourself to heart attack. So I'm wondering if this is kind of like a protective thing or a non-protective thing, especially with you describing it as a sphere as opposed to your, typical heart shape that we all love and care for.
Yeah, no, we have to change our emojis in space. We've got to use the circle emoji for the heart to express love. Like, it's a circle.
The heart's just trying to be more like the planet, just like this sphere and
like the moon, like
it'd be like that.
Yeah.
All right, well,
so good.
we're approaching. We call these orbits for a particular reason that I forgot about introducing today. But the International Space Station orbits the Earth in an hour and 30 minutes, and we hope to complete these orbits in an hour and 30 minutes. So we're approaching orbit. Obviously, I have plenty more to talk about, but I'm kind of curious. Where we stand, where I'm obviously still in the bone camp, I think, although it's through muscle that I would like to make the bone changes happen. But I'm kind of curious with our two undecided participants where we are in our muscle versus bone debate.
I think Kyle, I know this is almost like one of the first things you said, but to me it was the most like convincing part of the whole discussion. I think we kind of talked about it a little bit. Just the idea that a fracture is something that can happen. It hasn't happened yet, and I think one of the I guess I would want to know fracture data for astronauts after they return to Earth, right? Because if we're landing on the moon or we're landing on Mars, someplace with gravity, and if the fracture possibility is increased during that 2-week period, as we said, it's not something that would probably be a major issue here on Earth, right? I mean, because you can go see your doctor, you can do all this stuff in the hospital to make sure that the fracture is seen to, and being back on your feet in a little while. But out in space, to me, having even like a small fracture seems like something that might be one of those medical problems where you're basically saying, okay, this is a problem for which we have to send you back to Earth. And I just wonder. If fractures, if there are going to be more fractures in these future missions, that could result in like an early termination of the mission. And I think that's the thing that I would be most concerned about. Although, I don't know. I'm still a little bit on the fence. Not fully committed to bone, but I liked what you were talking about, the emergency context to it.
One last, my final closing argument is that I recently read a study that looked at reacclimation to 1G after a period of unloading, and it actually found, I believe it was in rats, but it found that the period right around reacclimation to 1G, like their first days and weeks back in 1G, they dramatically decreased they lost even more during that period of time. Wow. Like in my estimation, that would be something like a traumatic event. That they were mechano adapted to weightlessness, that once they started having this huge impact forces on the bone, that the bone wasn't able to comply with that and had a hard time and was traumatic. So I think in that case it's even worse than we might have thought. So that's my final point.
My kind of takeaway from that, Kyle, is that I guess from this entire discussion, even it seems like we're really going to need some mitigation strategy aboard for a long-term transit to some place like Mars, just to reduce these issues. And then it seems like very special safety precautions are going to be needed to be taken on landing, right? Because like another thing we mentioned with being discombobulated in a neurovestibular sense, like a lot of fractures that happen here on Earth are because of problems with balance, and especially as you get older. And it seems like if your bone density is going to be really problematic on arrival, and you're going to be not used to gravity of any kind over this period of potentially 6 or 7 months of transit time, you could be having a fracture on arrival that might, you know, be substantial enough that you need to go home right away, which would really suck.
And not to mention on arrival, but also just long term, you have to consider how the gravitational force is going to affect physiologically our Mars colonists.
For sure.
And good closing remarks, Kyle. I would like to add to all of that and build on Ryan's point as well, and say this is why we do space medicine. It's because we anticipate the risks that can happen, just like we do on Earth. People who go on big adventures, divers and mountaineers and long distance runners, and those are my favorite groups of people, and pilots and sailors, they all have inherent risks, all of those jobs. The more you do with your life, the more risk you put yourself at, and the more extreme environments you go in, the more things you have to anticipate. But that's why we do what we do, and that's why we put the research into it. Some of the topics we've discussed today can be insidious, things like atrophy or like osteoporosis, and some of them can be acute, like rhabdomyolysis or fractures. But that's the same as on Earth. This is not new information. It's just that it's a different environment, and we have less resources with which to work. And again, this is why space medicine is so challenging, and I think it's going to be the new frontier of space. It's no longer just about science and engineering and rockets and propulsion and fuel. It's going to be about how far we can get is not limited to how great our rockets are. It's how much we're willing to stand as humans, how much we can tolerate.
Yeah, it's the amazing last words. It's the frontier of medicine. You know, I really do feel like that. Feel that's the case, and just wonderful closing last remarks. And you know, just wanted to kind of wrap up if you guys are ready. Any last final things, thoughts and remarks?
After that, absolutely not.
But
I was saying after that speech, absolutely not. I'm good.
Well, Vienna, for any of our listeners, where can they find you and look at all of your wonderful work that you've done, and where can they reach you, contact you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Vistronaut. That's Vistronaut. And yes, I'm not on anything else. Just those two platforms.
Oh my God! How did you do that? There's so many platforms out there. That, like, how did you do that? It's crazy.
Yeah.
That TikTok. I heard that TikTok was the leading edge of space medicine. On social media.
Could you imagine if we got a tick? Oh my God. All right. Well,
they will control our future. Get ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm happy to call it even and shake on that, Kyle. What do you think?
Fair enough. Musculoskeletal, skeletal muscular. They're combined. We can be friends. We work so closely together that works for me.
Sounds good.
Hey, it's been a pleasure talking to you guys.
Likewise. It's been great.
As always, it was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks Ryan and Vlad and Vienna for joining me. This has been really fun to have like a debate. A lot of conferences kind of do this, so I decided to toss our hat in the ring. And luckily we have Vienna. Thank you so much for taking the time, and best of luck finishing your final year of medical school. And you said you're on the geriatric floor, right? So just best of luck doing that, and congrats on getting your COVID vaccine, and hopefully we will be out of this the COVID world and into the post-COVID world, which will look very different than the pre-COVID world. So and space medicine will just continue to grow, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. I hope to chat with you all once again sometime soon.
Sounds good. Love to have you. All right. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Space Medicine. If you want to continue the discussion and meet more fellow space nerds, be sure to check out @TalkSpaceMed on Twitter and the Let's Talk Space Medicine server on Discord. Thanks, and see you next episode.